So you've probably heard of Lectio Divina, or divine reading. It's known today as this really powerful, ancient form of meditative prayer. You know, a way to slowly, reflectively connect with the sacred text. But what if for the first 1,000 years it existed, that wasn't its main point at all?
Right. So when we think of the practice today, it's usually through these 4 steps, which were laid out way back in the 12th century by a monk named Guido II. You've got reading, then meditation, prayer, and finally, contemplation. It seems like a pretty clear spiritual path, right? Well, maybe not.
Guido called this whole process the monk's ladder, a way for them to climb right up to heaven. And that's a beautiful image, right? For centuries, that's pretty much been the accepted story. But it turns out this cozy devotional picture is only half of it.
And this gets us to the big, kind of radical question. What if we've been fundamentally misunderstanding this practice for centuries? What if, long before it was a ladder to heaven, it was actually a tool for something way more down to earth?
Okay, so here's the twist. For the early monks, Lectio Divina wasn't just some spiritual exercise. It was, first and foremost, a super practical, highly effective method for learning a foreign language.
The difference here is just huge. I mean, our modern image is someone sitting alone, quietly reflecting on a text in their own language. The ancient reality, it was the complete opposite. It was tough. It was you struggling with a foreign text in Latin or Greek, and it was almost always done out loud.
And why? Why was it so different? Well, think about it. For the first 1,000 years of the church, the Bible wasn't in English or Frankish or whatever dialect you spoke. It was in Latin or Greek. So for a monk back then, becoming literate meant learning Latin. The Holy Book was in a language he didn't even speak.
Now, to really get this, you have to try and imagine a totally different world. A world that was all about sound, all oral. A world where the idea of reading something silently in your head was, well, just plain weird.
Get this quote. It's incredible. Back in the 4th century, St. Augustine sees his mentor, St. Ambrose, reading a book without moving his lips, and he is so shocked by this that he has to write it down. That's how bizarre silent reading was. It was a total spectacle. See, in this oral world, words needed to be spoken to even feel real. The Latin word for prayer, oratio, literally comes from the word for mouth, ora. So prayer was something you did with your mouth. Reading was something you did with your mouth. It was a physical performance, using your breath, your tongue, your ears, not just your eyes.
Okay, so keeping that in mind, a foreign language in an oral world, let's go back and look at those first 2 steps of Lectio Divina again, because this is where everything just clicks.
So that first step, lectio, reading, turns out it wasn't about deep spiritual insights. It was a pronunciation drill. It was the most basic day 1 part of any language class. You look at strange symbols on a page and you just try to make the right sounds. It was all about phonetics, not understanding. Then you get to meditatio. The word literally means chewing the cud, like a cow. And what a perfect image. This step was all about memorization. A monk would just repeat phrases over and over and over again, not in his head, but out loud, physically working the words with his mouth until the grammar and the vocabulary were burned into his muscle memory.
So when you put it all together, the whole thing looks completely different. It stops being just a spiritual ladder and starts looking a lot more like a lesson plan. You start with pronunciation. Then you move to memorization and grammar. And only after you've got the basics of the language down do you actually get to the prayer and contemplation part. And all of a sudden, the weird parts of the practice make total sense. Why read so slowly? Well, because you're sounding out words you've never seen before. Why repeat everything? For memorization, of course. Why all the muttering? Because you're using your mouth to learn. These aren't some deep, mystical secrets. They're just solid, time-tested language learning techniques.
So what does this all mean? Well, it completely reframes the whole relationship between learning, hard work, and spiritual practice.
The real goal here was fluency. The idea was to get so deep into the sacred language that you could actually start to think in it. There's this amazing quote from an early monk, John Cassian, who said a complete prayer is when the monk finally actually understands the words he's saying. The spiritual breakthrough was literally tied to mastering the language.
1,500 years. Just let that number sink in for a second. For the huge majority of Christian history, for a millennium and a half, reading scripture wasn't like just picking a book off your shelf. It was this intense, lifelong school project.
And this ancient practice wasn't just about downloading information. It was about transformation. The very struggle of learning a new language, a new grammar,
new sounds, a whole new way of putting thoughts together is a massive cognitive workout. It's literally a way of rewiring your brain.
And that kind of leaves us with this one last pretty provocative thought. You know, we tend to think spiritual growth comes from peace and quiet and calm reflection, but what if this ancient wisdom is pointing to something else? What if the real growth, the most profound stuff, happens in the struggle, in the messy, frustrating, but deeply human effort of trying to learn something new?